Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode on TMJ's Political Current podcast. Today we have yet another live episode with a special guest. Kevork Almassian is a Syrian Armenian award-winning journalist and geopolitical analyst who is also the host of Syriana Analysis. Today he is joining me to break down lots of the ongoing events that are happening about Syria and looking at what to expect moving forward. Thank you so much, Kevork, for joining me, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I'm also looking forward. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course. And so I really want to start off actually about the new Syrian army, which is something that you have spoken about extensively. And, we're seeing in the news that there's lots of developments about how that is, forming. And this is basically a group that you have mentioned are pretty much Al-Qaeda fighters who are now in state uniforms. And the specific quote that you used that I think was very interesting was terrorist boots in military uniforms. So can you give us a little bit of a background? How come this is happening so openly and people are just accepting it like it's normal, especially given that we know, for example, on the United States side, we had a $10 million bounty on the leader of the nation right now. How do you think this is happening so openly and, people are just taking it as though it's a normal occurrence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a really complicated, in my opinion, intelligence operation in the past years, especially after the eruption of the Syrian war in 2011, to destroy the reputation of the Syrian army and also to demonize it to the extent that any soldier fighting for the Syrian army for his nation is basically someone deserves to be killed. And when you live in Syria, you know that as a citizen, or if you live in anywhere around the world, there is this social respect to people who go and join the military. So when you see a soldier in the street, you salute them, you respect them. If they need anything, for example, for transportation, you ask them to join your car. So there was this social contract between the Syrian people and the Syrian army, because the Syrian army used to come from the Syrian people.
Right.
So this has been completely destroyed in the past decade after the eruption of the Syrian war. So they have turned some of the components of the Syrian society against their own national army, and they have allowed them or urged them to fight against their own national army. And this has been a long-term Israeli strategy in the region, which is to destroy the national armies surrounding the Israeli occupation forces. And in this case, were the Syrian army. In Lebanon, we have a weak, for example, national army, and the Jordanian army is already embedded with the Brits, with the Americans, with the Israelis, so they don't pose any threat. So after the destruction of the Iraqi army and then the Libyan army, it was time to destroy the Syrian army. Now, after they destroyed it, they want to reform or reorganize a new Syrian army. Now, when Assad was ousted on the 9th of December, I wrote on my X account and I said, the maximum the Syrians can get from this outcome is an army that is based on police force, just like in the West Bank, Abbas's police apparatus, only to protect the system, the regime, but unable to protect the sovereignty, the borders, and especially to reclaim the Golan Heights from the Israeli occupation forces. Now, this has happened, however, it went even worse, and that is to include these multinational Takfiris into the Syrian army. Now, from the American perspective, at the beginning, they told Jolani, if you want us to normalize ties with you or accept you formally, you have to, there are many demands, 8 demands, one of which was to expel these multinational Takfiris from Syria. But Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, they have persuaded the American side and they have convinced them that it is better to include these multinational Takfiris and integrate them into the Syrian army compared to fighting them or demonizing them, because then they will become a threat to the system, the new regime in Syria, because those were and still are the most striking and most competent force in the Jolani army. Therefore, Jolani's so-called legitimacy is not based on the popular acceptance, but rather on the multinationals that he imported into Syria, and now he is incorporating them into the Syrian army. So we're moving from a national army into a mercenary army, and they can move these mercenaries anywhere around the world. And I suspect that the next target would be in Central Asia, and especially on the southern borders of Russia and on the Silk Road Initiative. And remember that this area is very vital and very strategic for different Eurasian powers, including Iran, China, and Russia. So what they're trying to do is first to incorporate these Uyghur Takfiris into the Syrian army, give them Syrian passports, and then move them outside of Syria. Just like Erdogan brought them to Syria, he can export them back from Syria into different conflict zones. And this experience has been already done in Nagorno-Karabakh. If we remember the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, basically, or the Armenians in Karabakh in the past few years, and Turkey brought many Syrian mercenaries to fight alongside the Azeris against the Armenians. So I would not rule out that the next step would be bringing Uyghur fighters into different hotspots around the world.
Right. And I think that's really interesting because I also did see how you were mentioning there's also now Uyghur militants that are part of the army. How is this happening? I mean, right now you're saying that the new militia is consisting of Takfiri extremists, of Uyghur militants. Why is it that, these are the ones that are included? For example, the Uyghurs, how come the Uyghurs are now part of this?
Because they are a very strong force. In the past 10 years, they have been the strongest force among what is called the Inrimasiyin, and also the suicide bombers. The Inrimasiyin are the ones who go with their guns, they fight, and when they're out of bullets, they blow up themselves. And the suicide bombers just go with the suicide vest or a suicide car. And they were the leading force in this. So they know how dangerous it is to antagonize the Uyghurs in Syria, not to give them what they want in the Syrian statehood, which is basically to be part of the Syrian society and give them Syrian passport, and also to become in position of power. Because once you become in the military, then you will ascend in the hierarchy in the Syrian army, and one day you could become in the position of a defense minister or chief of staff or even a president in the country. So this is a very dangerous precedent that you are incorporating completely different people into a supposedly national army. Now, the justification, if you listen to the people who support Jolani, they say, yeah, but these people came and they supported us and they helped us in this so-called revolution against Assad. But they're the same people who say that the minorities, for example, we don't want minorities in Syria. So there is this element of supremacy, let's say, among these supporters of Jolani, that it is okay to bring completely different people with completely different ethnicities, genetics, and cultures and experiences, let's say historical experiences from far away from Central Asia to Syria. But then the people who were born and raised in Syria, their grandparents of their grandparents of their grandparents were living in the Levant, they are antagonized and they are targeted by them physically, psychologically, financially, and up until this moment, every single day, the Jolani gangs continue killing especially the Alawites in Syria. It's not in the same extent like it was 3 months ago, but they are every day killing people in their farms, on the highways, and also kidnapping women. And this is a very dangerous, another dangerous phenomenon in Syria that we haven't experienced, let's say, under the previous regime, under the dictatorship. But now it is widespread, and unfortunately, many people are fleeing the country, including friends that I speak to. They are from Alawites or Druze or Kurds, and they say, it's hopeless. We don't want to live under such circumstances, and they leave the country. And this is emptying the country basically from its, let's say, cultural, richness, unfortunately. But they are importing Uyghurs from China.
And that's really interesting. And you've mentioned how obviously the US is now backing this. And we've also seen on an international level, obviously, Trump met with Jolani recently. We've also had, his surprise decision to lift the sanctions, which is something that many Syrians started celebrating. And I think I also want to get now into the Syrian public sentiment regarding the lifting of sanctions. I'm Iranian myself. When I saw the news about a lot of Syrians being happy about this and, being completely fine with, the leadership of Jolani because he's going to be someone who will bring them prosperity, or the lifting of sanctions, that's a sentiment that a lot of people who are living under sanctioned societies actually have, because when they've been suffering for so long, they will take any opportunity to have some of that relief. So what do you make of that public sentiment, especially the growing kind of support for Jolani among Syrians themselves who know his background? They're well aware of, the terrorist links that he's had. How come this is so pervasive now?
Now, the Syrian people have suffered, in my opinion, from these draconian sanctions for over 30, 40 years. The sanctions against Syria date back to 79, when the US labeled Syria as a state sponsor of terrorism. And terrorism, according to the United States, is, of course, resisting the US and Israeli hegemony in the region. And they accused Syria of supporting the Palestinian factions. Now,
Right.
the sanctions accelerated after 2011 for this exact same reason. For geopolitical reasons, they wanted to put pressure on the previous Assad government that you have to reorient the Syrian geopolitical posture on the side of what is called the moderate Arab camp, which means Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, or Morocco, and all these countries, UAE, the countries which not only accepted Israel, but also normalized ties with Israel, whether on the table or under the table, because there are so many Arabic countries, they deal with Israel under the table.
100%, yeah.
Yeah, so they wanted for Syria to normalize ties with Israel, and this was a position that Assad rejected multiple times until October 2024. And I know this for a fact, this is not an analysis, that the foreign minister of Jordan came to Damascus and said after the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, he came to Damascus, I think, on the 10th of October and said, now your dear friend, Nasrallah was a dear friend for Bashar, and said, he's been assassinated, and the Americans and the Israelis are determined to change the realities in the region. And this is the window of opportunity for you to do a fast shift on our side in the region. And we will embrace you, we will protect you, we will ask the Americans to lift the sanctions. But this means we have to seal the borders with Lebanon, completely cut the supply chains with Hezbollah, kick the Iranian and the Hezbollah affiliated forces, let's say, from Syria out, and also to normalize ties with Israel, which means they said, this will be an Arabic initiative. We will lead this process of normalization, and you would be part of it. Like, you're not going to do it individually by yourself. And Assad rejected that. And unsurprisingly, of course, 3 weeks later, Jolani did his offensive against Aleppo, and he occupied Aleppo. And then they still, by the way, when Jolani occupied Aleppo, the Arabic side, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they still tried to persuade Assad, saying that there is still a possibility to force these Jolani forces to withdraw again from Aleppo if you seal the borders with Lebanon. And when this was rejected, they continued the operations and they ousted him from power. In any ways, now all the demands that the US was asking for Syria in the past 20, 25 years, especially after the invasion of Iraq 2003, Jolani came from day one. He said, all the demands that you asked for Assad, I will follow them and I will implement them. And he will normalize ties with Israel. He already accepted the sovereignty of Israel over the Golan Heights. The Sana, for example, which is the state outlet of Syria, they call Golan Israeli territories. In the diplomatic cables and the diplomatic statements, they use the term Israel, the state of Israel, and not the Zionist entity like the previous regime used to say. So they are also open to cooperation, security cooperation with the Americans and with the Israelis against Hezbollah. So all in all, it's a perfect candidate for them to lead this, especially that if there is going to be a fight over Lebanon, because I suspect that there is going to be a phase 2 of conflict in Lebanon, if this so-called diplomatic effort to disarm Hezbollah do not really proceed well, then I suspect that they will unleash these Nusra and Uyghur and Qaeda forces against Hezbollah instead of sending Israel to do this business. So there is a huge sectarian hatred and sentiments against Hezbollah for being a Shia from the Jolani side. And they would, in my opinion, not hesitate to attack Hezbollah forces inside Lebanon if they are tasked or if they are asked. So all these conditions, when we put them in front of us, we see that it is normal for the U.S. to lift the sanctions against Syria, because this was against the Syrian people, because they want to improve the chances of Jolani to survive. What the Americans believe is that Jolani is the best candidate to rule over all this Takfiri scene, and also on the Sunni people in Syria. This is how they believe, like Aleppo, Idlib, Homs, Hama, Damascus, for example. South of Damascus is already demilitarized zone imposed by Israel. Eastern shore of the Euphrates controlled by the Kurds. Sueda controlled by the Druze. So the only let's say minority group left is the Alawites and the Christians to come together and form a political body to prepare for a federal system in the country. So it's a win-win situation for the Americans in the country. That's why they lift the sanctions. Syrians deserve to celebrate, of course, but thanking the US for lifting the sanctions is like thanking the kidnapper for kidnapping you and then releasing you after paying the ransom. It's ridiculous. It's a Stockholm syndrome. I understand. However, the worst thing is that we have now lots of trumpets for Jolani in the press, by Al Jazeera, by Al Arabiya, by many of these Gulf-funded outlets. They're peddling that this is a great achievement, but this meant Syria has taken off all its clothes, and after that, now they are lifting the sanctions. So,
absolutely, and I think that's the reason why I mentioned, public sentiment, because we know that, as you said, for example, Syrians as Sunnis might have, issues with a Shia group like Hezbollah, but they have always been supporters of Palestine, especially the Syrians themselves. The Syrian people have been supporters of the Palestinian cause. And now it's almost as though seeing the normalization that's happening with Israel is almost like a, I guess you could say hypocrisy that's happening here. And it's almost like they don't know how to kind of deal with both this sentiment of wanting relief from sanctions and, betterment for their people, which is what they truly believe is happening. And we'll get to that as well. But, also seeing how their leadership is now completely normalizing with Israel. And I was going to ask you, when you mentioned to what degree has Jolani already normalized with Israel? I know we've been talking about the Golan and all of that, but in terms of diplomatic ties and what's happening on the broader international level, to what degree has this normalization already happened, and what does it encompass so far?
I will give you a few examples. You tell me to what level this normalization has reached. Official delegation from the Jolani government visited Tel Aviv, and they sat with security officials from the Israeli side. The Israeli Mossad and Secret Service, they came to Damascus. They went into one of the security apparatuses of the Jolani government, and they have questioned and tortured one of the Palestinian leaders belonging to the Palestinian Organization for the Liberation of Palestine. This is a left-wing Palestinian unit in Damascus, in order to locate the remnants of Israeli lieutenant general who died in 82 in Marj Sultan battles in Lebanon, and also to locate the remnants and the belongings of Eli Cohen, who was an Israeli spy, and he was hanged and killed in Syria after being exposed as a spy for Israel. So there are strategic relationship between the Mossad and the CIA, but at no time the CIA or the Mossad allow even their allies to come to their units and torture someone on their own soil in order to get words out of the mouths of someone who is being kidnapped by the Jolani regime. Jolani has kicked out all the Palestinian factions from Damascus, and his official media calls Golan Israeli territory. Therefore, the normalization has already happened. It
I mean,
always starts rhetorical, and then it moves on the official level. But what Jolani is expecting is an Arabic initiative led by Saudi Arabia and others to lead this campaign, because he doesn't want to look like he's someone who is just betraying the Palestinian people, because many people in Syria support the Palestinians. However, this mood is also, in my opinion, shifting, because now there is this defeatist narrative being normalized among the Syrian people, saying basically, we're weak, we don't have an army, we've been destroyed, we already fought for 14 years, we cannot do this, we want peace with Israel.
Exactly.
And there is a difference between someone who doesn't want to fight because he's weaker, and compared to someone who is already recognizing his own territory as part of the enemy, as part of enemy sovereignty. Like you probably want to come and say, I cannot fight Israel, they are superior and our military is destroyed, so I don't want to go into suicidal war against Israel. But then you don't have to recognize the territories occupied by Israel. Those are Syrian territories as part of Israel. Those are two different things. But Jolani has gone too far. He has recognized Golan as part of Israel, and also has given the Mount of Hermon to also the Israelis. He allowed the expansion of Israel into Syrian territories. And now, technically, militarily, logistically, in every aspect, Damascus is under the control of Israel, because they control Mount Hermon, which means they can fire howitzers, basically artilleries, and reach Damascus. They don't need even a fighter jet to bomb Damascus if they want to. And also, this Mount Hermon also overlooks inside Lebanon, where the Hezbollah side used to use to bring in weapons, ammunition, and let's say logistics from Syria, from Iraq, from Iran. Therefore, Israel has a area, let's say, military overlook in the entire region, including Damascus and inside Lebanon. So Israel is in a superior position here.
And you've mentioned obviously how, Israel and America in this situation, their agendas go hand in hand, but you've mentioned how obviously the US now, as well as backing these hybrid militias, as you've mentioned, like the new Syrian army. And I guess the natural question that arises here is, what interest in specific would you say the US has in all of this? I guess you could say for Israel, it's a little bit more obvious because of their, I guess, position in the region and wanting to secure that. For what interest would this have for the US, knowing that, backing these militias? I mean, it's not a great look. Even Americans looking at what's happening right now are like, why is the US now suddenly, changing his position on a guy they had a $10 million bounty on, and, just the past that he had. And, the new militia that's now forming with the specific, people that are forming it. What interest would you say, the US has in all of this?
The US strategic threat comes from China, not from the Middle East. The United States, there is a strong argument in the United States that we have to minimize our presence in the Middle East. And also we have to end the Ukraine war, because the real threat is from China. And when they say threat, it's of course a competition. Now in the Middle East or in West Asia, the Americans will not just withdraw and make a vacuum for other powers to come and fill in, especially if it's Iran or China or Russia. Therefore, they have tasked their allies, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, to take over the files that the Americans used to manage in the past. And one of these is Syria. So when the special envoy, Barak, I think I forgot his first name, but he's the American ambassador in Turkey as well. He's the special envoy to Syria. He says the era of Sykes-Picot and the Western intervention in West Asia, he uses these terms, is over. But what he doesn't mention is that the Americans may withdraw from this physically, but they're overlooking these changes in the region through their allies. namely
Right.
Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar.
Mm-hmm.
And now Israel also joined this, let's say, process in the region, which means Syria is under the patronage of these four powers: the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, and the Israelis. Now, in this case, the Americans say, okay, if you guys can manage these affairs and if you can keep these militants passive in Syria, keep them within the borders of Syria and not to endanger Israel, for example, that's fine. In the future, if we can use these militants in other hotspots against our enemies, that's even better. And this is how they did in Afghanistan, and this is how they did in Libya, this is how they did in Syria, and they can copy this experience later, that we create a hotspot for these takfiris that we can easily transfer them into other hotspots around the world. And I think this is the goal at the end of the day, that the Americans would give Syria to these powers to manage, so the Americans can have, let's say, can save time and energy and resources for the negotiations with Iran, because they want to strike a deal with Iran. It seems quite clear that Trump doesn't want to go to war against Iran, but the terms they are asking from Iran is also, in my opinion, it's very difficult for Iran to accept, because if Iran accepts the terms of Trump, then it practically means a soft coup or a soft regime change within Iran itself. So Iran is also in front of a dilemma that they will not accept such a deal, but at the same time, they're unable, let's say, to eliminate the American influence from the region. So the smart thing for the Iranians to do is to go national, like pursue national policy. We preserve our sovereignty, we preserve our resources, we negotiate with the Americans, and we wait for the circumstances to change. Now, the Americans are in a hurry. They want to strike a deal now because, as I mentioned at the beginning of answering this question, the Americans' focus is on China. So they want to reorient their resources toward China after Afghanistan. The Ukraine war, many people argue it's a big mistake. They shouldn't have flared these the fires in Ukraine, because they brought China and Russia closer to each other, and this is a strategic threat for the United States. Therefore, they want to stop that. They want to end the antagonizing the Russians. I'm speaking about the Americans, not the Europeans, and focus on China. But I think this is not going to work well for the Americans, especially to find a rift between China and Russia, because these two powers, they have completely different, by the way, political systems, different civilizations, and different geopolitical interests around the world.
Right.
But they share the same strategic threat, and that is the US is determined to come after these powers and to diminish their economic growth and their military growth, because in a multipolar world, the Russians and the Chinese will have to decide in some of the cases something that the American political elite, or let's say the psychopathic elite, this is what I call them, they will not accept. They are really dangerous people. They're really arrogant people, and they don't want to give up any of their leverage and influence around the world, something that puts the world in front of a great challenge, and that is this cycle of endless wars initiated by this very tiny class of people in the United States, which they profit and we lose. We are all the people, like whether we're in the West Asia or in Europe or in the United States, the American people do not benefit from this wars. It only creates more inflation. It creates more economic burden on them, something that only, let's say, benefits this very tiny elite. So the change has to come within the United States. Otherwise, we are going to continue with this US empire mutating after mutation after mutation and presenting itself in different forms and shapes. But there is one thing that is intact, or let's say something that doesn't change, and that is this imperialist intervention around the world. But the style and the optics change, but the core of the issue remains the same.
Absolutely. And one other, you mentioned China, and I think that's absolutely right. But there's also, another, I guess, perspective to this, and that is this whole idea that, there's this greater Israel plan. And that the whole point of, the U.S. backing, all, Jolani in the first place, as well as, the new militia that is forming in Syria, also has to do with, securing itself and securing, its position in the region for this greater Israel plan. Now, I was talking to Scott Ritter last week, and one thing he mentioned, which I think was excuse me, interesting, was he was mentioning how, this greater Israel plan that a lot of us are speaking about is not just limited to, the United States and Israel, but judging from especially the developments that we're seeing from the US and its relationship with the Gulf nations now, especially after Trump's visit there. It seems that, there's almost, the Gulf nations are in on it as well. And now Syria, that is, in some ways seeking legitimacy through acceptance of these Gulf states, is also a part of that. So what do you make of that, that perspective of it as well, that dimension of, the US involvement now in Syria?
Now, the Greater Israel Project is not a myth and it's not a conspiracy theory. It's a real project, and the Israelis are implementing it like practically on the ground. Their officials say it like on statements in documentaries and in interviews. Now, do I believe that the Israelis can create a Greater Israel Project, which means that between the Nile to Euphrates that the Israeli Jews would control? No. They don't have the demographic capacity to control all large swaths of territories like that. But they are able to control this region in different means. They can control it financially, they can control it economically, politically, having proxies controlling these regions, and most importantly, through technology, AI, and data. And this is something that I want to mention, and this is really, really, really serious. When the pandemic corona crisis started, has anyone in Syria or Iran or Lebanon, people who use these apps, do we really know what was the task of these apps? Do we know who stands behind these apps? Do we know if these apps have collected information from us? Do we know if they located our GPS and our locations? Because this is an issue that Israelis used in the past. For example, this new app, the Spy Max, that now we found out now, thanks to an investigation, that an intelligence secret service, basically, they have created a Telegram account, which I know now the handler of this Telegram account, and they have created it in the same logo and the same name of the Syria Trust for Development. And Syria Trust for Development was a humanitarian NGO operated by, managed by the First Lady of Syria, Asma al-Assad. So they have started sending via this Telegram account messages to a few Syrian soldiers telling them that you have to download this app and you have to type, like when you install the app, they ask you for your name, birthday, and for your military status, for example, position, and where are you serving, because this organization will grant $40 for Syrian soldiers and injured Syrian soldiers as like financial assistance. And what happened is that they have mapped the entire Syrian army positions on the entire Syrian territory, including the senior officers in the Syrian army, which meant that the Jolani army knew where are the weak spots of the Syrian army when they attacked Aleppo. So this is something that I would suspect that this is an Israeli-American operation. So they are able to use these technologies and weaponize them against their enemies, like what happened with the pagers, with Hezbollah, like what happened with the infiltration of the very high level of Hezbollah. And I would suspect part of it is technologically. So this is why I say the Greater Israel Project doesn't have to be only with military force, tanks, etc. They can create a free market area, for example, in this region, dominated by the Zionists, for example, and investments are from the Zionists. And this is what is going to happen, and is already happening in Syria. Who is getting all the licenses for reconstruction, for extracting the oil, the ports, etc.? They are all this World Economic Forum. They are the Zionist bankers. They are the ones who also got the biggest share in Ukraine. The BlackRock, for example, the Vanguard. They strike exclusive deals for reconstruction in these countries after they start on these unfortunate wars. So from whichever side you look, sometimes some people say, Kevork, you're being so pessimistic, but I'm being just honest. Like, I can see that this
You're
is
being a realist. Yeah.
yeah, like it's working in front of us like a clock, for example. I will give just a quick example. Like
Yeah.
Jolani was on the Jewish, there is a magazine called the Jewish Magazine, right? And he
Mhm.
told the Jewish Magazine, so speaking of normalization, when was the last time Bashar al-Assad has given an interview to an Israeli Jewish journal? It never happens, right? So he
Right.
gave this interview to the Jewish Magazine, basically saying that we share common enemies with Israel. This is his
Right.
words. And then something very interesting also happens. A so-called resistance group pops up in Daraa, fires some fireworks on the Golan, and
Yeah, I remember that.
an anonymous person with an anonymous name, nobody knows his face. And now this is some sort of a threat against Israel because they fired a few candy rockets against the Golan. Now the Syrian side condemns this attack on Golan, which is a Syrian territory, and calls it an Israeli territory. And the
Wow.
second day, Jolani's security forces, they stage, and this is so clear that it is staged because
Mhm.
the cameras were ready and everything was ready to run on
To
a
shoot it.
van,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah, and they capture basically some vegetables filled with weapons and ammunition inside, and they say this is going to Hezbollah. And if you connect the dots, you see that if all this Jolani we share common enemies with Israel. He means Hezbollah. He condemns attack from Syria on a Syrian territory, calling it Israeli territory, and then miraculously finding these weapons allegedly destined to Hezbollah. So he is sending all these signals to the Americans and the Israelis that he is ready as boots on the ground to fight against Hezbollah. And this has been something that I was very hesitant in the past to say, which is Al Qaeda is a contract army for the United States. But look at the map of the battles that Al Qaeda participated in the past decades, especially starting from Afghanistan. Almost in every very serious geopolitical conflict which happened, and Al Qaeda fought on the side of the US or against the enemies of the US. Even in Yemen, Al Qaeda and ISIS fought alongside the Hadi forces against Ansarullah. In Libya,
Yeah.
they fought against Gaddafi. In Syria, they fought against Assad. In Lebanon, if you remember 2013 and 14, how many car bombs they sent to Dahieh, to the southern suburbs of Beirut. And I used to be there. I used to work in Beirut, and we
Oh wow.
couldn't like move around because there were car bombs almost every day. So all these things, if you put it into perspective and add on it the statement of Professor Mikhail Hudson, who is a brilliant economist, he says, Al-Qaeda is a contract army for the United States. I'm not saying that these regular fighters are, but on the leadership level, definitely is. Jolani was in a CIA-operated prison
Mhm.
in a camp in Iraq, and we know very well how the Americans recruit these Al Qaeda operatives in the prisons, including Baghdadi, because Baghdadi and Jolani were in the same camp.
Mhm.
And coincidentally, both of them were released in March 2011. So in March 2011, this was the same month that the war of Syria started. And Jolani went to Syria, he formed al-Nusra, and Baghdadi went to Syria and he formed ISIS. So your respected guest can do the math, and the rest is history, because now Jolani is in power. He is not only endorsed by the US, he is legitimized by the US, he's supported by the US, and they see him as their man in Damascus.
And you mentioned ISIS right now. I really quickly want to draw attention to a headline that we saw come out last week, was how ISIS took responsibility for the attack against this, I think it was against the Syrian army.
Mhm.
How does ISIS fit into that narrative? Because I mean, there's a lot going on right now in terms of, this new militia that's forming. How does ISIS fit into that narrative given this recent attack? What would you say about
ISIS,
that?
ISIS is the boogeyman, which says that if we don't accept these multinationals into the Syrian army, then they will go to ISIS and they will
Hmm.
join ISIS. ISIS is a very useful instrument in Syria to legitimize the presence of the American forces, for example. They say we're fighting ISIS. Now Jolani will send Hexes, the defense minister and very senior officer in the American army, to Damascus very soon in order to strike a formal deal with Damascus or Jolani to legitimize the presence of because up until this moment, U.S. forces are occupation forces. But now
Right.
they will strike a deal with Jolani, giving the Americans an unlimited and open window presence in Syria under the justification of fighting against ISIS. Like the ISIS elements are with few hundreds now in Syria. They don't hold any stronghold. They don't have any city or governorate. They are in the deserts and they come and attack and they withdraw. But if we
Right.
understand how ISIS was formed and how ISIS operated in Syria, and the intelligence work behind the creation of ISIS, it is ridiculous to assume that ISIS is just an independent force and acting by itself against any actor in Syria. ISIS is a boogeyman, is a Frankenstein created due to the policies of the US in the region and with direct participation of different Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, in arming, financing, and including non-state actors in Kuwait. For example, Kuwait was a major supporter of ISIS and al-Nusra in Syria, and MPs from Kuwait were present alongside Al-Qaeda supporting them on the Syrian territories. So there is no lack of money in
Right.
the Gulf. And unfortunately, this money is going to the destruction of our civilization in the Levant. Meanwhile, they are building for themselves these Dubai-like economies, let's say, and I'm not against that. If you want to do like that, it is your country. I'm not intervening, but you're destroying our economies. And now we have to be dependent on this financial aid from Saudi Arabia and from Qatar, knowing that Syria has oil, has wheat, has cotton, has water, has everything to rebuild its country. But now we are dependent on the Gulf countries because our economy is in tatters and our oil fields are in the hands of the Americans. So they have choked Syria from all sides. And when you ask me about the Syrian people, it's a situation like somebody is drowning and you're giving him like a small leaf to hold this leaf and get up
Yeah,
and
and I
save him.
know that
So,
sentiment well because I mentioned to you I've seen that with Iranians because I'm Iranian myself, but knowing how difficult a lot of people start living under sanctions, knowing how much pressure they come under, it's almost as if there's this desperation for relief. And when
yeah,
that comes, it's almost as if they forget the history.
yes,
Even with Iran, I know it's a very different situation, but we've had history there. The people know what it looks like when the US in all ways has control of every aspect of their country, whether it's the oil, whether it's just about everything.
yeah,
So they've seen that under the Shah. They've seen that multiple times, but it's almost as though because the pressure becomes overwhelming, there's almost this sentiment of whatever can bring us that relief, we're fine with it because we finally deserve to breathe. And that's a
yes,
sentiment I see coming out a lot from Syrians is, I've spoken as well to Syrians and said, you guys have always been defenders of the Palestinians, and now you see your own leadership shaking hands with Israel, shaking hands with the U.S. What's going on? Is there no kind of moral dilemma there? Or even if, let's say, not even the Palestinians, your own people, you've seen the history of, countries like Libya, Iraq, even Egypt to a certain extent, what it looks like when, certain kinds of militia start forming, what happens when the U.S. takes over, it essentially wipes out that, any notion of national sovereignty. So how do you make sense of the sentiments that are coming from Syrians right now? Do you think that they still will start realizing what's actually happening to their country and, kind of standing for wanting a little bit more of that national sovereignty without having so much influence from the US? Or do you think it's, become a lost cause?
I think when I read the comments and statements, I think these media outlets in the region have created parallel worlds in the mind of the people. I speak to friends Some of them were supportive of the revolution, some of which were supporting even Jolani. And now I still talk to them because I want to know their sentiments, and they're like always in a celebratory mode. Like, this is the freedom that they were seeking for, and this is something spectacular happened because they believed all this time that the minorities were ruling over them, and this is a complete bollock. Sorry for the for these words, but Syria has never been a sectarian authoritarianism. It was a political authoritarianism. There was a centralized powers, but not based on sectarian or ethnicity, but rather on political loyalty. So
Right.
you would have faced Christian Alawite prisoners in Saidnaya more than Sunni prisoners, because many Alawites in Syria in the 70s and 80s, they were either communists, or Syrian nationalists, for example, and the Ba'ath Party was an Arabist nationalist socialist party. They have cracked down on the opposition, even the left-wing opposition in Syria. So now these people, I would like to draw a distinction between ordinary people and people who are leading opinions, right? Because the situation in Syria was built, the narrative was built in the past years that this traitorous, treasonous Assad regime has sold the Golan Heights to the Israelis, and they don't want to fire a bullet on Israel to liberate these territories, and they're cowards. So we will come to Syria from all around the world because we want to support the Syrian people, and we, the Syrian people, we will rise against Assad so we can create a state that is basically helping the Palestinians and liberating the Golan Heights. And this is how they encouraged many thousands of people to join these militants in Syria. But once they came to power, now they're changing the narrative into, we are weak, we are unable to fight, incapable of fighting Israel. But there is a difference between not being able to fight against Israel and not wanting to or wanting to recognize the Golan as part of Israel. So, in my opinion, I think many people, especially on the ordinary people, they're really hypnotized by this continuous bombardment of short videos and all these TikTok streams. And if you turn on your Al Jazeera, you would think that Syria has become a Switzerland. Like they're really
Absolutely.
selling illusions. They're selling illusions to the people. And I said on the 9th of December 2024, Syrians will soon, they will be told, you will own nothing and you will be happy. And this is the same slogan of the World Economic Forum, because Syrians had a national economy. They didn't need foreign investment. That's why when the sanctions were imposed, that was not enough, because Syrians, if you have an oil and the wheat and the cotton and an agriculture, then even if you are sanctioned, you will still manage your internal affairs because you have self-production.
Right.
But the Americans noticed that. So in 2018, they imposed these scissor sanctions. So the Americans occupied first the oil fields of Syria. So they deprived the Syrians of using the oil to reconstruct the country. But then if you want to import any materials from outside, even if it's in an ally country, let's say in Russia or China, the Russians and the Chinese companies have interests in the United States. And Syria is a small economy and small market. So imagine these sanctions, they give the US Treasury the right to impose sanctions on third state companies, let's say in Malaysia, in Thailand, in China, if they deal with Syria. And that means if we buy a medical product from China to repair some of our hospitals, this company will be sanctioned by the United States. So everyone started to boycott Syria because their interests are larger with the United States. And this led into the impoverishment of the Syrian people. So they couldn't really win this war until they impoverished 90% of the Syrian people and pushed them below the poverty line. They took over the oil and gas fields. They have burned the wheat fields in the eastern shore of the Euphrates, and they have controlled the border crossings with Iraq and with Jordan. How do you want for Syria to survive under such circumstances? Therefore, now that they have reached everything that they wanted and even more, they will lift the sanctions. But who will invest in Syria? They are the corporations. these multinational corporations will come, they will invest in Syria, and the Syrians will move from a national economy into an open economy, and the investors are all foreigners. They will create job opportunities, but the Syrians will own nothing of these companies, which means at the end of the day, Syrians are just slaves. There's a slave class working for a corporation, receiving whatever is necessary to bring bread on the table, but they're generating huge profits for these multinational corporations. And that's why I said, Syrians, you will own nothing and you will be happy, because this is what it looks like. People go to the street and celebrate their own slavery. Unfortunately, when I watch this, I don't know if I should laugh or I should cry. Maybe it's just my psyche is
Both.
giving me, yeah, my psyche is telling me laugh about it, because if I
It's too
cry,
sad.
I will be really upset. And this is something that is incredibly sad in Syria, that really you can literally brainwash millions of people if you want to. And that's why I said it's very dangerous, this era of social media, AI, and the way they are manipulating data, they're manipulating our timelines, because they tested all these things. Like, they can push certain content to you, they can manipulate your emotions, they can make you angry, they can make you happy. So everything is on our smartphones now. So people have to be really
Exactly.
responsible. Otherwise, if you're just scrolling like this, they can push any content they want on you. And that's why China has its own unique algorithm, because they don't want to push this content on their own people. They want to push scientific stuff, mathematics, engineering for their children. Unlike in other countries, you see it's just about belly dancing and sorry to say, but
Exactly. Yeah, and
so
that's
many
exactly
different
what
things.
came.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's what you're saying is absolutely true, and it's almost the social media plays a huge role, because it almost starts to subconsciously make people accept certain things, and that's something that we've seen a lot, especially with, I see a lot of this content being pushed about, this new Syrian government that is causing a lot of the outpour of support that we're seeing online on social media from Syrians. And I guess I want to close this conversation with a question that it's hard to predict, but I think you would know, given the history of Syria and other countries as well. Is there comes a time where Syrians will come to realize what's happening, and as you mentioned, this whole I guess honeymoon phase is going to end, and there's obviously right now ongoing the persecution and the killings of minorities like the Christians, Druze, the Shias. Usually what happens in these situations is, at first, there's this power that takes over and there's very little resistance. But over time, you see that there starts to be a little bit of resistance that starts to build. We've seen some small examples of it with people kind of pushing back. But where do you see the resistance against this current government coming out from within Syria? Where do you see that going? Do you think it's something that is going to grow over time, or not at all?
I think Turkey and Qatar are building a deep state in Syria.
Mhm.
Just like there is a deep state in Egypt. Remember how they ousted Morsi because they
Yeah.
had a deep state. In Syria, they are building a deep state so that even if in the future, in 10 years, in 20 years, because I believe Jolani is going to stay for some time, and even if he's replaced or killed or something happens, there is a system that is recreating itself. And this
Right.
is something you notice in the West. The
Hmm.
West holds elections, parties change, but the headlines remain the same. And this is something that they are building and copying in Syria. Therefore, even if in the future people say this is not right, we have to change, they will distract them with creating political parties. They will distract them with different crises, social crisis, economic crisis, so they back off. So the truth of the matter is, because they're building this deep state, that's why they asked the United States to accept the integration of these Uyghurs and Central Asian Takfiris into the Syrian army, because they don't want to stop this process now. And that's why Jolani asked 4 years to hold elections. Do you think that he cannot rewrite the constitution? Rewriting the constitution takes maximum 3 months. And this has happened in the past. But he wants 4 years. Why? Because in these 4 years, they want to put the foundations of this deep state. They want to sell out the country to these multinational corporations, the ports, the seaports, the airports, the telecommunication, oil and gas. and also sharing the spheres of influence between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel in Syria. So this is the task of Jolani. Therefore, there is no any military or political power inside Syria capable of challenging this status quo at the current moment. In the future, if there is regional support, international support to some elements in Syria, there could be a movement rising against Jolani. But until then, I don't see any organic domestic movement against Jolani capable of challenging him. I mean,
Right.
after all these massacres in the coastal cities, he killed thousands of Alawites. There was no military reaction against Jolani because people don't have weapons. And if there is no one giving them weapons, then they will be slaughtered if they rise against Jolani. And this was the lesson Jolani wanted them to learn, that if you think of rising against me, this is the destiny that is waiting for you. So he deliberately slaughtered all these Alawites to send a message to all the others, whoever you
Right.
are, that if you challenge me, this is what is going to happen. And everybody now is scared, except, of course, the Kurds and the Druze, because they have a strong military force and they have a backing in the international scene. But the Shias, the Alawites, and the Christians, the Yazidis, the Ismailis, they have no one in their back. Also, the Armenians. That's why many of the Christian, for example, priests and leaders in Aleppo, they get along Jolani. They have to get along because
Right. They
the
have no other
alternative
choice.
is no. So I respect what they're doing and I salute them because this is a really difficult time to live in under such a regime. But their responsibility is to protect their community. That's why the good thing to do is to stay in good terms with Jolani. Otherwise, the alternative is what happened in the coast.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Kevork, for joining us on today's live episode. Very insightful conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.